Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason. For the third time today, I'm back on YouTube. I know it's a little crazy, but I'm here with Philip Cottraux, and he's one of my friends that I met on social media, and he's written this book. So the book is called Bringing the Exodus to Life. And I have to admit, I'm not quite, because I got stuck in doing different work things, so I'm halfway through the book. And the book is really good book. I mean, it's amazing, actually. You've done so much great research. I've got to finish reading this book. This is my to read book right now that I've got to finish because I have to say it's really good. You went into some really interesting, deep pieces of information about the Exodus. And so let me ask you this, Phil. Actually, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then we'll get into it?
Okay, Stephanie, thank you for that glowing introduction. I don't know what else I can say about myself now. My name is Philip Cottraux. I run a blog that's stepsofpentecost.com. I've been running it for about 5 years now. So it kind of started out small. I mean, I'm just a Sunday school teacher. I'm not a professionally trained historian or anything. And so I would do these classes at Sunday school, and people would tell me they were really good and they really enjoyed them. So I would start sort of writing summaries of them and putting them on a blog so people who missed the class couldn't be there. And it started to grow and it started to get a bigger audience. And then I got on Twitter and it sort of snowballed from there. And this book actually started the same way. I was just doing a study on the Exodus without any intention of turning it into a book. And then I just sort of kept going, and it snowballed from there. And next thing I know, I've written an entire book and I'm trying to get it published and things like that. So yeah, I'm a Christian blogger and I'm a Sunday school teacher. Basically, those are the two things. I specialize mostly in Bible classes and Bible studies. If you go back to like my first blogs 5 years ago, they were more like fiery sermons and things like that. But I've sort of moved on into just general apologetics and history and Bible studies and things like that. So.
Yeah, that's good. And I noticed one of the things that you've done I'm going to go ahead and make Jordan a moderator because she's a champion for being here 3 times today. so,
I know,
so
and
I'm
you had Dr. Michael Brown on before me, so that I was like, oh, geez, no pressure now that she's got Dr. Michael Brown on, and then now me.
No, you know what you've done in your book that I think is really great is you actually you're kind of going against some of the current theory from some people on exactly when the Exodus occurred, and you had traced from different pharaohs. And so, where do you stand right now on the pharaohs of the Exodus?
Well, when I first wrote the book and I got really excited, I was studying a new chronology by Egyptologist named David Roll, and I was really excited about it. And I was like, wow, this completely reconfigures the entire chronology. And so I was really confident when the book was published. But since then, I've read some more because I knew at the time that Roll's chronology was more of a minority position in the archaeological community. And I've read some more negative things about it since then, and I'm a little less confident in it than I used to be. And so I'm a big fan of inspiring philosophy, Michael Jones. I'm like so you got his attention, and I squealed like a fangirl. I'm like, wow, Michael Jones has noticed me. And then the first question he asks is, who does he think the Exodus Pharaoh was? And I'm like, oh, that's not what I wanted to ask. So in the book, I make the case that it was Dudimos II, but he was towards the end of the 13th dynasty. And so the traditional chronology of Egypt puts it a little bit further back, maybe by a few hundred years. So David Roll's chronology, it changed the chronology so much that it says that the traditional chronology is off by hundreds of years. So, for example, a lot of us think that that Ramses or one of the New Kingdom pharaohs might have been the Exodus pharaoh, but he actually places King Saul during the reign of Akhenaten, which was that's like a 400-year difference. So I've read more critical things about it since then, so I'm not quite as confident as I used to be. I realize I may have embraced something that was more of a minority position than I thought at first. But and then Michael Jones told me on Twitter that he's going to make a video arguing that Amenhotep II was the Exodus pharaoh. So I'd be interested to see that. But even if my chronology that I embraced was off, I'm still confident in the evidence for when the Exodus happened. I'm still very confident that it was in the late Middle Kingdom towards the end of the Bronze Age.
Yeah, and you made a good argument with that because you also pointed out to some archaeological findings and things in support of the Exodus. Because a lot of people, when they use this incorrect, and I would say that it is incorrect, the current, some current predictions, or I shouldn't say predictions, but some current views on exactly when Exodus occurred. Some people have these views, and then the problem is we don't have the support for a lot of it with the archaeology. And you actually pointed out some ways that we would have that support if we chose the other date.
Right. Yeah, it's really a fault of pop culture, I think, because, for years now, every year growing up at Easter, we used to watch the Ten Commandments, and, my generation had the animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, and people really like to look back on Egyptian history and find the most famous pharaoh they can and try to imagine those as Bible characters. So, like, Ramses the Great was probably the greatest pharaoh, in the New Kingdom, and that was when Egypt was at the height of its power. So it would just make the story so much more exciting if that was the Exodus pharaoh who got his comeuppance by God at the hand of Moses and everything. But it's probably not historically true, and so that's part of our problem. But then on the other side, you have atheists or skeptics who say there's no evidence that the Exodus happened whatsoever, and I'm like, well, Egypt was a 3,000-year-old kingdom. I mean, and we don't even know who all the pharaohs were, what happened during all their reigns. So I don't really think it's fair to make that statement either. I mean, in thousands of years of history, you can't really say for sure that it didn't happen based on, no evidence. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. And I think it's good that people do investigate this stuff because we do get to the truth. And the nice thing is that a lot of people who look at texts, who look at biblical texts, and they look at non-biblical texts, a lot of people, if they take an atheist or agnostic position, will favor the non-biblical text over the biblical one to try to sometimes discredit what they find in the biblical text. And I think that as Christians, I actually take the opposite view, which sounds like presuppositionalism, but I would look at what's in the text and then look at the outside stuff and match it up to it. But if there seems to be an inconsistency, the way I would look at it would be to favor the biblical text.
Right.
And I think that seems like what you're doing too. You mentioned something else I just mentioned today on one of my on my second video that I made is something that you mentioned that I think is amazing that I didn't know, but this idea of the Egyptian gods and how there was this idea that we have these Egyptian gods and each of the plagues that came upon the Egyptians were related to those gods, and basically God's way of proving that they're not true.
Yeah. You do see the pattern kind of emerging there.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And so on, what else would you say as far as bringing the Exodus to life? What would you want people to know that they might not know right now about the Exodus?
Well, for one thing, if you're a Christian and you're on the internet long enough, you're going to start seeing what I call pseudo archaeology, and there's some false information out there. And a lot of that can be attributed to a guy named Ron Wyatt, who I guess his heart was in the right place, but he was an amateur archaeologist. Actually, I think he was an anesthetic nurse from Tennessee. And he went to the Middle East on a lot of self-funded archaeological journeys and discovered a lot of things, but he had a tendency to really proclaim that he had found something amazing. One time he claimed to discover the Ark of Noah. He claimed to find, there's these chariot wheels with coral on them at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. Then on the other side of that is a big rock with a split going down the middle. And so sometimes you'll see like pictures appearing on Twitter. Look, they found proof, archaeological proof that the Exodus really happened. And I think we tend to jump to, we get too excited about that stuff. So I would advise being cautious about things like that. And actually, I'm speaking from experience because I got fooled by that once. When I first saw the Ron Wyatt stuff, and I saw the pictures of the chariot wheels at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, and I was like, wow, they did find Egyptian chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea. And I even taught my class that once in Sunday school. And now I look back on it and I was like, I should have been a little more skeptical of that before I jumped to conclusions too quickly. So I actually spend a lot of time in the book trying to clear misconceptions like that about, Ron Wyatt and about pseudo archaeology and being too careful to jump to conclusions too quickly. about seeing things that I guess it's sort of like confirmation bias. Like we see stuff we want to believe that proves the Bible, so we tend to just really jump on it real fast and get excited. So
Yeah, yeah, I think that's I fault with that too, because if I saw the thing is, if you see a chariot wheel and then you say, okay, that chariot wheel definitely must be attributable to the particular pharaoh who was in power at the time of the Exodus, and so
yeah,
you're making an assumption, and so unless there's some way to date the wheel, you might be making a
well,
faulty assumption.
there's a book that I did use as a reference, and it was by somebody who worked with Ron Wyatt, and I do use it as a source sometimes, but it's really fascinating because it's called The Exodus Case, and it's by Dr. Leonard Muller, and he's got pictures and things like that of what they took. And what he has a tendency to do, because I think the book is wrong, I think it's full of all sorts of wrong information. It's a good example of what I'm talking about. Like there will be a cluster of coral reef, and there will be a picture of it, and they'll say, "Look, there's a skull. If you look close enough, you can see like the trace of a skull or some femurs, and this must have been a group of Egyptian charioteers who were trying to flee as the Red Sea came crashing down on them, and things like that." So yeah, and I really, if you look at it skeptically, all they found was one human femur bone and I think an ox bone and one chariot wheel, and the rest of it to me looks like it's probably just coral outgrowths that they're pictures of them, and if you look at them the right way and squint, you might can make out a skull or something like that. But my big issue with it all, though, was that the Gulf of Aqaba, in my opinion, there's no way the crossing of the Red Sea could have taken place there. It's like 200 miles away from where the Exodus actually. It's on the complete other side of the Sinai Peninsula. So
Hmm. Yeah. So what's your take on who wrote? Because this is another big issue. People always are talking about uh, whether Moses wrote the Exodus or wrote the Pentateuch, and I'm just wondering who do you think wrote this, since you spent so much time on it?
well, yeah. So I do support Mosaic authorship. I know the documentary hypothesis is very popular in historian circles, but part of the problem is, like, allegedly you can take segments of the Torah and they're written in different styles. And I've actually seen somewhere where someone tried to actually color code them, so like certain sections are red and certain sections are blue. And there's all these theories that have been presented over the years, like, well, it was a priest that wrote it during this time period, and then this section was written by someone else hundreds of years later. But to me, that's kind of incoherent. Like, you can't really just read the red sections or the blue sections and it really make any sense. Now, as far as the different styles are concerned, I mean, it wasn't uncommon for people to write in different styles, or to have scribes who went with them. So I do think Moses wrote the majority of it. I think he probably had like, I don't know, secretaries, if you want to call them, who wrote down, and that could explain the different styles or the different letterings or whatever. But to me, it's a clearer, simpler, easier explanation that Moses wrote the majority of it. Now, obviously, Moses dies before the Torah is complete, so it's not hard to think that somebody else wrote the rest of it after that. But
Yeah. So do you think that Moses was the most humble man in the world?
that's a good question. I probably so, at least at the time. I mean, he didn't want to go. He came up with all kinds of excuses about his, inability to speak and everything like that, about why he couldn't go. He really just didn't want to do it. I mean, he was on the run for his life. He was a murderer. Like, I'm sure he didn't really feel worthy to be called by God to go set the Israelites free. So
Yeah, yeah. He was I actually think that's kind of funny how he did that. So I mean, if you felt like God is telling you to do something, he's like, no, it can't be me. I can't speak. Like, didn't I
yeah,
give you a mouth?
yeah. Yeah,
And
and what's
so
funny about that is that God tells him next that, well, I'll just, meet up with your brother Aaron and he'll be your mouthpiece. And you just tell him you whisper in his ear what to say, and he'll just speak the words to Pharaoh. But the Bible doesn't say that actually happened after that. So it seems like Moses still did the speaking after that. And I guess Aaron was just there to offer emotional support. I don't know. So
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. And actually, I think the whole story of the Exodus, I was talking to an atheist one time on my channel, and she was saying that she thought, well, why would God have them just sort of circle around and around and around out, for 40 years in this little tiny vicinity? And I said, well, if the story were made up, don't you think that it would have been much different than that? It is kind of embarrassing the way it sounds like they're just meandering around in the forest for 40 years. So
Yeah, and the Israelites don't come out very well in the story because they're full of doubt and they're constantly complaining. They're thirsty, they're hungry, and God's wrath is poured on them over and over again. And usually in ancient Mesopotamia with origin stories, if they're very legendary, the people would make up their origin, and they would be like the chosen people of the gods or the people that rose out of, like, yeah, it's hard for me to believe that they fabricated that, considering all of the mistakes they make and all the times they doubt, and they don't really come out of the story looking very good. So
yeah, no, they don't. They don't come out of the story looking very good. In fact, that's just like the apostles in the New Testament. Is Peter's going around denying Jesus. They're doubting him. They sound kind of like they're bumbling. It's kind of like the bumbling stooges. I mean, I don't want to sell them short because obviously they became tremendous martyrs and heroes. But
right,
I just want to say it's the same thing in the New Testament as the Old Testament. We got a lot of embarrassing stories in both of these books, and certainly the Israelites who would have written the books, basically they didn't make themselves look very good.
right, exactly.
And so that would usually people write about themselves and try to puff themselves up. I mean, just like look today on Facebook, how many people puff bad things about themselves up on Facebook? Like today, I just had the worst day ever. And people don't do that. It's like, this is the greatest day ever. And look at my kids. They're also, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people do when they're writing and trying to create a narrative.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I don't really like Facebook that much.
Yeah, I know. I don't like it either, and that's why you said I need to get on it, and everybody I know tells me I need to get on it, and it's like, oh, I don't want to get on. I know I should because I've got a book out and I'm trying to get people to buy it and things like that. But that's one of the reasons why I don't like it, because it's like you're looking at people. They make their lives look perfect. They have the most perfect pictures of themselves and their kids, and they make it look like their lives are perfect and happy and wonderful, and then you compare your own life by comparison, and you're like, well, I'm not happy, well, now I'm depressed, I'm not as happy as they look in these pictures. So
Yeah, and I've actually seen studies at higher levels of depression for people who spend a lot of time there.
right.
So yeah, that's pretty crazy. Yeah, so if you guys just joined right now, this is the book we're talking about. We're talking about bringing the Exodus to life, and I'm got the author right here with me, Phil Cottraux, or Cottraux, you said, right?
Actually, yeah, great job on the pronunciation. Most people get it way wrong. It's either Cottraux or Cottraux. It doesn't really matter.
Okay. Yeah,
But
so
most people butcher it way worse than that.
are you working on any new books now? Are you still writing?
Yeah, I am. I really wanted this book to be a series, and that's why it says the Bible Life series at the top. The funny thing is, when I came up with the title, I thought, well, this would be great to have it. I guess what you would call the Bringing the Bible to Life series. And unfortunately, there's already a book series out there called the Bringing the Bible to Life series. So my publisher came up with this as an alternative, the Bible Life series. But I guess I should have started with Genesis, but the book started as a study of Exodus, and it just sort of snowballed for there. So I sort of want to do themes of the Bible that don't get talked about much. So we talk about the Old Testament prophets a lot, but for the vast majority of that, we talk about Daniel and Isaiah and Ezekiel. And I've noticed that the minor prophets don't get much recognition. So, I mean, a little bit here and there. So I'd actually like to write a book focusing entirely on the minor prophets.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, like Joel and Malachi and Obadiah and things like that. I think, taking the same approach as I did to this, I think that would be really good. It's on my mind, and I've gotten some stuff together, but I just haven't had the time. Like, publishing a book, you get really busy trying to promote it and get it out there and get people to notice it. So I haven't really had the time. That's my next idea, but I haven't had the time to really sit down and start putting it all together yet.
Yeah, no, that's I think that sounds really interesting, because you're right. I'm very interested in the book of Daniel, and obviously I'm one of many, like you mentioned. I tend to focus on Daniel and Isaiah, and so I'm guilty in that same group. So
And that's fine. The major prophets are amazing and fantastic. I just feel like the minor prophets, and like, it's so interesting that there's prophecies in the prophetic books that came true in history. Like in some of them, we think, oh, Bible prophecy, like we're waiting for that to happen still, but a lot of them already came true. And I noticed that in Obadiah because, you know, the Edomites were, judgment was pronounced on them by the prophet Obadiah for attacking, you know, the Israelites and raiding the leftovers of Jerusalem after Nebuchadnezzar had, you know, seized the city and destroyed the temple and everything. And that prophecy did come true. And it was, I think it was Josephus that recorded that it, when the temple was destroyed, there were still some Edomites left, and the last of them were wiped out by the Romans during the Jewish rebellion in 70 AD. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And that's another one. You bring up Malachi, and Malachi 3:1 points to the anointed one appearing in the temple. And the
Right.
temple that was around at that time was the second temple. And just like you mentioned, it was destroyed in 70 AD.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
so that glory has to have been Jesus because the temple is no more. So otherwise, that prophecy didn't come true.
Yeah. And we also have Daniel 9 pointing to that same thing too. So we also know that he had to appear in the temple. So I mean, we've got a lot of pretty neat things. I like, you know what, one people haven't talked about that much, I don't think, is everyone talks about Isaiah 53, but I really don't hear many people talking about Zechariah 12:10, which basically also talks about a piercing.
Right. Yeah, they will look upon me whom they have pierced, you know, coming in the sky, riding on the clouds, or whatever
Yeah.
it says. I don't have it in front of me, but paraphrasing. But
So how long have you been, well, actually, I'm going to ask you your views on Genesis too in just a second, but how long have you been doing this? How long have you been teaching Bible school, or I'm sorry, teaching, yeah, Bible
um,
study?
I started teaching on Sunday schools about 9 years ago.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, and it's funny because it was actually my church was having like a men's retreat. So we went to like a couple of log cabins out in the mountains, and I was speaking. The person who was scheduled to speak that night couldn't make it, so they asked me, and I'd never taught anything in my life, and I had a paralyzing fear of public speaking. And this was like, you know, about 10 guys, and I look at it now and it's like that would be like the easiest class in the world to teach now. But you know, like back at the time, I was like, oh man, I'm really nervous, man. What if I fail? What if I stutter? What if I make a fool of myself? And but it ended up being good. So then they asked me to be a Sunday school teacher when we got back, and like I said, it's just slowly grown from there. It's not something I really had planned on. It's just something that's sort of been happening to me over the years. So
Oh, that's great. That's
yeah.
great. Yeah, no, that it's interesting what you say with public speaking. In fact, I've read things that people just really don't like public speaking, and I used to hate it. I remember my senior year of college. I remember my last speech in a capstone class. I was shaking to, you know, I could see my hands shaking. And then when I decided I wanted to teach, I got this job at Lynn University. I only taught there one semester before I decided I had to go get my PhD. But I got a job at Lynn University. I stood up in front of a class, and the same thing happened. I was shaking. It was awful. But then the more you speak, the more it comes out of you, and you suddenly don't. I mean, I've spoken now in front of 400 people at a as a keynote speaker up in another university. So it just changed. I don't have a fear anymore, luckily.
Yeah, yeah, you get used to it, especially if you do it well enough and you start getting like the pats on the back and everything like that when it's over with, the handshakes. Wow, that was great. You did awesome. You know, and that kind of helps build your confidence each and every time. So,
It does. It does. So what is your take on Genesis? Because and I'm asking this is because I actually don't know your perspective. Are you a young Earth advocate, or are you an old Earth, or what do you think about that?
I'm older. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's I am too, actually. So we're on the same page with that. And I was just listening in for a few minutes to this unbelievable channel that was on today with Dr. Swami Mas,
Uh,
I think is his last
Swami
name.
Das, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess he wrote a book that's speaking to this kind of stuff, and he talks about evolution in the book. And so, do you have a take on Adam and Eve if they were true historical figures, or do you think that they might have been more metaphorical?
Um, yeah, and I've heard the interviews. I'd like to read Dr. Swami Das's book as well. I think that's really interesting because he's sort of making the case that there's two ways to look at Adam and Eve. There's the historical Adam and Eve, and then the genealogical Adam and Eve. So we can all people in the world, with a couple of exceptions, can still be descendant of theirs, uh, even if we can't exactly trace our lineage. At least like because he includes the Y chromosome and the X chromosome, the mother and father, or something like that. I haven't read the book, so I'm doing a horrible job of summing it up. But yeah, I do believe Adam and Eve were historical figures. Um, Certainly. Yeah, I think the Garden of Eden was a real place. Now, I don't really hold to the idea that it was 6,000 years ago, because I'm sure that you've heard that that number was really concocted by James Ussher, I think in the 17th century.
Hmm.
And while some people say that's the gospel, that's what the Bible says, 6,000 years old, but really that number isn't really in the Bible. And I've even heard the genealogies don't really add up to 6,000 years, and the different genealogies say different things. So I don't know how long ago Adam and Eve lived. I'm really skeptical of 6,000 years. I mean, it could have been 13,000 years ago, it could have been 70,000 years ago. I don't think it really matters. I think it's one of those things that we sort of get too hung up on and miss the point of.
Yeah, and I do think there are different ways to look at it. And I mean, it is interesting. I still think it's very interesting when we think about the fact that if humans have walked the planet for somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago,
Uh,
if that's the case, then how come we only have information from the past 10,000 years in history? We only have written
mhm.
history in the last 10,000 years. So I just makes me curious to know. I mean, there could be a whole potential where there was another world kind of similar to ours that was basically overcome and destroyed. It was
Right.
like, I mean, in all that time.
Right, right. And that's kind of, I guess, what you call the gap doctrine, which is the belief that, like there was a world that existed between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 that the Bible doesn't say how long it lasted. And, then it was wiped out. And then we have the beginning of a new world as well. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Well, I like your take on because I've also looked at the genealogies, and just for the audience, just so they know, is what you look at when you look at the genealogies is the assumption that the authors mention the people that they felt were important. Just like in the books, when you have the women discovering the empty tomb, the authors focus maybe on one or two of those women. Was something where they might not point out all of the women, but they were focused maybe
Mhm.
on only Mary Magdalene. It's kind of the same idea with the genealogies. The authors might have figured out which people in history were important, and there could be a big gap between, like, it could be a reference to one person, and then like uh, generations later it's a reference to another person in that same family line, but maybe we don't mention some of the ones in the middle. So
Yeah, yeah, and I've heard other takes on that. Like, what Genesis is recording is the tribal heads or the patriarchs. So it's really not every single person that lived from Adam onward. It's just the ones who are the head of the tribe of Adam's lineage or whatever. While that, I mean, I'm kind of, I don't want to say agnostic, but I'm kind of back and forth on things like that. I don't think it's as important as people think it is. It was just a long time ago, and when we get to heaven, maybe the Lord can explain it to us there and tell us who was right. So
yeah, I think you're right. I don't tend to place much emphasis on Genesis either. I notice a lot of people do, especially the Ken Ham types, and
mm,
I think it's because he's got a big arc that he wants to send people to, or the Kent Hovind. He's got this
right,
idea that he's got a little ministry going and he's trying to attract people. But I think that if you just really focus on the resurrection, our whole Bible is written about Jesus, and
right.
it's not supposed to be about Adam and Eve and their dating of when they came here. So
Right. I like to think of the Bible as like the solar system. And so like you have the sun and then all the planets and everything in the solar system is sort of revolving around the sun. I think of the resurrection of Christ as the center point, and the whole Bible is revolving around it. So like all of the events in the Old Testament are pointing towards the resurrection, and all of the things that happened afterwards are pointing back to the resurrection, are happening because of it. And so like we can't decide if Pluto is a planet or not. I mean, maybe we can ask Sarah Salviander what she thinks of that. But it's like it was so far out there, it's unclear which exactly it was. And I kind of think that about, like, I would compare that to Adam and Eve and to Genesis chapter 1. It's like it was so far back in the distant, murky history, so far removed from the resurrection that um, how exact is the story, and where's the line between mythological and historical blurred. you know it's hard to really say for sure just because it was so long ago.
yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that. It's kind of a difficult question. It's one of those things. Um,
Right.
have you had any, now I see you and I met each other on social media on Twitter, and I'm just wondering,
Mhm.
so have you had any pushback on your book from maybe atheists or anybody? Has anyone read it who's sort of a hostile person towards what you're doing?
No, not yet. I did see a little bit when you tweeted the book out and said you were going to have me on. I know better than to do this because I don't usually scroll down and read the replies to anything you tweet because of the horror show that awaits. But I saw one
So
atheist
true.
had said, like, we hear you bring a story to life that didn't happen. And I'm like, oh no, a snarky comment from an atheist on social media. Oh, I've never seen one of those before. Wow, oh, my mind is blown. Like, come on. But yeah, I haven't gotten too much pushback yet. But
Yeah.
if more people buy it, maybe I will. Who knows?
Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely a really good book. And so again, if you guys just joined, I know a couple people in the audience are just joining. So bringing the Exodus to life, and so I also wanted to ask you about oh, what was I just going to ask you? It had to do with shoot. I'm losing my train of thought. I'll have to think about what it was. So
I was so scared that was going to happen to me during this too.
yeah, no, dang it, I had a really good idea in mind, and so
Well, it'll probably come to you after we're done. Maybe.
I know that's how it usually works. So what, aside from your book, have you read, what would you say are some of the more interesting apologetics books that you've read? I mean, you're looking at, as far as people like Sean McDowell, I guess, has a new book out. Susan's been talking about that. I haven't read that one yet, but then there's William Lane Craig, some of these classic apologists who are out there. Would you recommend any of those apologists to?
As far as apologists go, I mean, if we're just talking about apologetics in general, I mean, there's, obviously the classics, The Case for Christ, the Lee Strobel books, The Case for the Real Jesus. I enjoy those. I've got two of J. Warner Wallace's books,
Yeah, I do too.
The Case for Christ that was Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene. Those were both pretty good. And there's a lot of really good books just about the historical evidence for the Bible. Some of the ones that I looked at that I referenced in the book itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, you got a lot of good sources in your book. I did notice that. So you've done your homework, and I noticed it was very meticulous, very well put together, and really interesting actually, because I know what I was going to ask you. Where do you think the Ark of the Covenant is today?
And that's a good question, and that was one I was going to say. And it's so do you know J. Randall Price? Like, is the author?
I've heard that name.
He's got a really good book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's also an archaeologist who specializes in that sort of thing. And he's got a really interesting book on the Ark of the Covenant, and where, I mean, ultimately he concludes we'll probably never know, because what's most likely is that it disappeared, and Jeremiah probably hid it somewhere right around the time of the Babylonian siege. And it's interesting that the Ark is never mentioned again, even though it was like the most important thing in the Old Testament. After it vanishes, it's almost like it's disregarded by the Bible. And when you study that subject, you'll go down some wild theories, because there's a lot of people think it's in Ethiopia, but when you read the story behind that, it just doesn't make any sense. That was actually, there's a religion called Rastafarianism that claims that the marijuana plant was the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And when you read the Kebra Nagast, you can actually see that.
I didn't know that Rastafarians believe that. I know some Rastafarians. I didn't know they believe that.
Yeah, well, that's what I heard, or that's what I read. So like,
wow.
The Kebra Nagast says that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, but if you read the story, like, it was captured and it was taken to Ethiopia to be hidden, and then like there's stories about the people carrying it got into a battle with snakes with beards coming out of their bellies, and just all kinds of wild, like the Ark sprouted wings and started to fly at one point. It goes really out there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, that's interesting. Now, Sentinel Apologetics, that's Rob. He says the Ark is gone. Jeremiah 3:16 says so. So I didn't, but so do you think, I mean, I wonder, I have to go, I'm trying to pull Jeremiah 3:16 up here. Let's see what that says. So let's see exactly what this says about the Ark. It says, in those days when your numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, people will no longer say the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. It will never enter the minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. Darn. Okay. So I wanted to find that. I was ready to set out like a, Raiders of the Lost Ark and see if I can't go to, because I've heard the Ethiopia hypothesis too.
uh-huh.
So it must be maybe the idea is it was removed. Maybe God somehow, it's someplace we'll never find it, and maybe it's the idea that Jesus is really now the ark.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good one too. I don't think it really matters theologically. It's more of a historical, curiosity at this point. But yeah, there are some interesting stories, and there are some people who are claimed that it's buried in an underground chamber underneath the Dome of the Rock Mosque, where Solomon's temple, used to be, and things like
Hmm.
that. And there's archaeologists with all kinds of claims that may or may not be true about they came this close, because they were digging tunnels underneath the Dome of the Rock Mosque, but then the Muslims caught them and they were asked to leave and things like that. But they were just this close. It's just it's wild, all the different theories out there. It's actually wilder than the movie itself. The Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. Some of the stories out there, but I don't assume we'll ever actually know where it is. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I find that kind of thing fascinating. I find if any sort of archaeological evidence that we have that helps us to, that does support the Bible, I always think is very interesting. And what's interesting is when Jesus said something like, if people are quiet, then the stones are going to cry out. And so over the years, anytime that we've had people saying, oh, well, this, the Old Testament's corrupt, the New Testament's corrupt, and suddenly we get something like the Dead Sea Scrolls that basically wipes out this notion that the Old Testament is corrupt, because it's basically the exact same thing that's from about 150 years before Christ. So,
right, right, yeah, most of them are. Yeah, I think the only one missing is the Book of Esther. They still haven't found that. But when I read J. Randall Price's book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was written about, I think, in the mid '90s, and they were talking about the discovery of a 13th cave, and he was like, "Well, nobody knows for sure if there's a 13th cave there, but a lot of people think there might be." And just in recent years, they discovered the 13th cave, which has more scrolls in it. So I've been keeping an eye on that to see what else they'll find. And they're, outside of just the Bible, the copies of the Old Testament books, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls that have shed a lot of light on, just history, that little slice of history in Judaism at that time and things like that, what the culture was like. They found a treasure scroll that's like a treasure map, and it claims that there's a buried treasure hidden somewhere.
oh, really? How interesting.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of people who have like used it and tried to make sense of it, and they're looking for some sort of buried treasure somewhere in the sands of the desert in Israel somewhere. They haven't found it yet, to my knowledge, but
Wow.
yeah.
That reminds me of something. This is completely off topic. Well, it's not quite off topic. There's a guy who goes around in Florida where I live. He goes around with metal detectors at the beach, and supposedly he's found over the years, in like 20 years, $6 million worth of coins and gold and all kinds of stuff, according to him. So it's like I think I'm in the wrong business. I should be walking around the beach with a metal detector.
Well, that's good for him, but I don't have the patience to do things like that. I see guys walking around with a metal detector, and I'm just like, I would get too bored and too discouraged too easily. So.
Yeah. Well, we have it down here also. We have in Key West, there's a guy called Mel Fisher, and Mel Fisher spent decades trying to find the shipwrecks from Spanish galleons that were full of treasure. And he finally did. He ended up hitting the big one, and worth millions of dollars. And so they've got a big museum down in Key West for that. But I'm like you, I'm not going to sit out at sea day after day after day trying to find these treasures that are way down deep. It's like, I
Yeah,
just don't.
it takes a special kind of person to do that, and I think the same thing about paleontologists. When I was a kid, like you really young kids are like, I want to be a paleontologist when I grow up, because I really find dinosaurs fascinating as well. But the kind of personality it takes to actually go out into the middle of the Gobi Desert or out into the Montana Badlands and spend days and days and weeks out there in the middle of nowhere and just looking for like a tiny sliver of a tooth or something. Like, yeah, not for
Yeah.
me.
Takes a lot of patience. And Brian Stevens, I see you say, I don't think they'd be walking around the beach. It was actually in the news, this whole story about this guy with the metal detector, or else I wouldn't have made it up. I mean, I actually find it really hard to believe that he actually made that much money. So, so I'll just say that I saw it on the news. It could be fake news, the old fake news idea. In later tradition, Jeremiah is credited with having hid the ark in preparation for the reestablishment of the United Kingdom and the restoration of the temple in 2 Maccabees 2:4-8, according to Rob. So that's pretty interesting.
And when the second temple was built, a lot of Jews were actually offended by it because they didn't believe that the sacrifices could continue without the ark. And so you had these little cults of Judaism that refused to take part in the second temple. And actually, that's who the Ascetic Jews were. You had this radical cult of Jews who sort of isolated themselves and did their own, sacrifices, and they thought the rebuilt temple uh, under Ezra and Nehemiah was like a heresy and things like that. And so they just became more and more isolated over the years. And that's why they made all that time, they made such meticulous copies of, the Bible books. And that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. They hid them in the caves around the Qumran region. So, and actually what's funny is that I've read that the reason why the Ascetic Jews went extinct is because they got so caught up in like apocalyptic literature that they stopped having children, and that's why they all went extinct. So
Oh, wow.
they were so convinced that they were living in the end times, and like they were so paranoid that Rome was coming to destroy them all and everything like that. They just didn't see any use in having children anymore, and then they all died because of that. So
That was it's an interesting way to go out. That's
yeah.
so Rob is adding here, but that's tradition. Jeremiah 3:16 makes it clear that it's gone and never seen again until in heaven in Revelation 11:19. So Rob has obviously been studying up on the Ark of the Covenant, and you can tell I have not been studying up on the Ark, which is why I was trying to glean knowledge from you.
It
So.
sounds like we have an entire debate going on in the comments down there, aside from what you and I are talking about. So
Oh, the Atocha. Yeah, that was the one. That's the Mel Fisher one. And yeah, he had a huge legal battle. I want to mention what happened. The state of Florida decided that once he, he actually lost his son too, while he was trying to find treasure, this Mel Fisher. And so he had gone through a lot of tragedy, and he lost the son while he was doing it. I mean, while they were out on the boat. And so what happened was he finally finds all this treasure, and the state of Florida decides that they want all of the treasure. They didn't want to give Mel any of it. And so he sued him, and Mel won. They said finders keepers in the courts, which is great.
wow, good for him.
Yeah, and very selfish in my state.
Mhm.
So biggest or successful find, Martinez once found 6.5 million worth of gold coins. Yeah, there is a certain thrill. I think there's a certain kind of person who does that kind of stuff. They just go out and look for treasure, and I do find that interesting. Do you think there are any other what have you heard that's an archaeological find that you find interesting, maybe aside from the ones that we just mentioned with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I mean, as far as like the ancient Near East goes, I know like we're sort of living in. I think we're living in the golden age of biblical text, because we're finding a lot of other texts from the other cultures at the time, like the ancient Israelites had neighbors called the oh gosh, what was the name of that?
Well, you've got the like the Code of Hammurabi.
Well, yeah, that, but the name of that other kingdom that they discovered that was next to Israel, it's slipping my mind for some reason. They found other text, and they found mentions. So, like in the book of Job, you have the behemoth and the Leviathan, and they found another kingdom that was near them that has a sacred text that also mentions like a calf who was like the god of fertility, and then a fire-breathing dragon that lived at the edges of the earth. It was like the Lord of Chaos and things like that. I know it's going to come to me later. I can't remember what the name of that other kingdom was. But yeah, they're finding new things in the Middle East that are shedding new light on the historical context of the Bible, and I just think that's very interesting. Really interesting stuff to find.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things that I like thinking about is the this idea of the third temple since Israel has come back, 1948, all this kind of stuff. And it just makes me curious to know where they would locate that third temple, because you just mentioned that of course, there's the mosque that's right over the temple mound where the second temple was. So what are we going to do about that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and if it happens, I mean, then there's some really interesting stuff. I've seen parallels between the Islam and the Muslim Mahdi, which is their sort of their Christ in a way, like their savior. And the description of the Mahdi actually reflects on our description of the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. And a lot of Muslims have actually made those parallels, which is really interesting stuff.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
kind of scary.
Yeah, kind of scary too. And I would get scared whenever Iran would make nuclear threats and things like that, because they believe that actually starting World War III will usher in the arrival of the
Oh
the
yeah,
Mahdi, I think. So yeah,
that's
that's
exactly.
why uh, a lot of those tin pot third world dictators make really empty threats, like when they threaten to blow up or annihilate people. But Iran scares me a little bit because they've got the religious fanatic angle that they bring to it.
Yeah, they
But
do scare
they've
me.
got other problems on their hands now with the coronavirus. So
So, oh, there's a question. There's a couple things. So Susan's saying it's Hittite. She
uh,
had asked if you'd seen something, and I missed it. And I didn't get it written down. I should have. But also I also have. Have you seen the Timeline documentary on the Exodus? I have not. Have you seen the Timeline documentary?
is she talking about the Exodus, the patterns of evidence?
I don't know. I'll wait. That's actually Mr. Phil Fox is asking that, so I'll wait to see if he adds
Okay.
on to that. Yeah, so I haven't seen that. I have to say though, like you mentioned, I think sometimes what we are seeing on TV when they're actually, let me go back a little bit. So when I was still kind of coming back to Christianity, when it
Uh,
was probably around 2011, 2012, I find myself watching a lot of these shows on TV about like the lost Bible texts and all this stuff, and they
yeah,
bring out these Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, and
yeah,
I never, I read those and I thought, oh my gosh, boy, we didn't know anything about that. And then I find myself on a plane next to a pastor and I bring it up to him after he'd been telling me all about Isaiah 53 and that kind of stuff. And I brought up the lost text and he's like, oh my gosh. And he basically lambasted those people for coming up with that stuff. But that's what the news does. They
yeah,
sensationalize things.
yeah. And by the way, Ugarit was the kingdom I was thinking about. So it
Oh,
finally came to, well, but yeah, you're right about that. There's a lot of sensationalism that goes on. I know it drives real historians crazy when things like that come out about about the Gospel of Judas, or um, I mean, really from both angles. Like any serious historian, even if they're an atheist or a Christian or a religious person or whatever, it's like the sensationalism I know drives them crazy when things like that happen. And I like all these years later, historians are still trying to undo all the damage done by the Da Vinci Code, for example.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's another one. See, that's another thing. So I read the Da Vinci Code when I was still kind of waffling around, and I actually was pretty taken by it because I hadn't studied anything into Christianity at that point. I
Uh,
hadn't looked in the history. I mean, I just thought, wow, is this really how it could be? I mean, you get a gullible person or someone who has really as little knowledge as I had at that time of Christianity, even though I was raised as a Catholic and went to Catholic schools.
right.
The Da Vinci Code made me question, and
And
so.
it's funny, and people love good conspiracy theories, and so there's a lot of real sensationalist books sell a lot, and that's why you get books like that. And there's actually another one about the Exodus that was recommended to me, and I can't remember what it was called because I didn't actually keep it; I was just borrowing it. But it was sort of like, I would call it a Christian version of the Da Vinci Code, but it was about the Exodus, and it was these two guys telling a story about they were going out into the middle of the desert and they found evidence for the Exodus, and they have all these really crazy over the top stories about the Saudi Arabian government was trying to, it was top secret, it was at a top secret base, and they were trying to keep them out. There were soldiers armed with machine guns trying to protect some sort of secret, and it must be the Exodus that they're hiding, evidence for the Exodus. And it's like, well, if it's a top secret Saudi Arabian military base, that may be why they didn't want you want you in there. So yeah, that book was really crazy. But for the life of me, I can't remember the name of it. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I've seen videos and stuff like on that kind of thing where they have there's some mountain in Saudi Arabia that people think has some ties to the Bible.
it's the mountain is Gebel Laws is the name of it, and the belief is that is Mount Sinai, because that part of the world, like I said, that mountain actually has discoloration on the top of it. So it kind of looks like burn marks. So people could say, well, that's where God came down and the fire of God melted. But really, the discoloration of the top of the mountain is done. It's caused naturally. It's like the basalt granite and its exposure to the sun just does that as a natural phenomenon. But and there's also at the base of Gebel Musa, there's like a series of really ancient ruins, and so there's a tendency to look at those and like in that book, they claimed, oh, this is where the Israelites encamped, camped out and everything at the foot of Mount Sinai, and this is where they made the sacrifices to the golden calf. But actually, those ruins are like from the Roman era, so they couldn't have possibly been. They're, maybe 2,000 years old, things like that. So you just
Yeah,
have to watch the sensationalism. You have to try to use skepticism and reason to cut through all the sensationalism. So
you do. So I want to ask you, how did you come to Christianity?
I was born and raised in a Christian household. Pretty much not really that exciting. I grew up in a Christian household, but it's one of those funny things when you're raised in a really strict Christian home and you're really like the Bible is really grounded into you, and you're never really exposed to the world or anything. You're just told, stay away from the world. It's evil. It's the devil. And so when I got into college, it's like my strict Bible upbringing just collapsed and fell apart, and I sort of got into the wild. It's one of those classic cliches, the wild party animal, things like that, and getting really into sin and discovering addictions and things like that. So I spent for years wondering myself, and it's kind of like I did have my doubts about Christianity. I really started to doubt whether it was true. But I sort of, I guess deep down inside, always knew it was. So, but I just put it on the back burner and was like, I'll come back to that someday. So I ran away from God for a few years and basically started going to church again. And it didn't happen overnight. It was sort of like slowly bringing me back in. The first time I went to the church I go to now, which I've been going to for 16 years, I was like, yeah, I just came here one time to be a visitor and I'm not coming back. And then, I ended up going again, and I was going only on Sunday mornings. And then, then I'd start going a little more often in the week, like they have a Sunday night service and things like that. And it's like the Lord slowly brought me back. And then I discovered Christian apologetics as well. And that, like, the doubts I'd been having about whether Christianity or the Bible was true really fell apart after that. Because when I started studying apologetics, and I try to be fair. That's why I don't really debate atheists on Twitter as often. I used to, but I don't do it as often anymore because, like, I almost to a fault, I'm too sympathetic to both sides. I'm not very good at debates because when people are arguing with me, I'm just always trying to understand why they are thinking what they're thinking. So the problem was, like, I tried to be fair and objective, but I noticed that the atheists were actually, I noticed a lot of things like what we talked about. They claim that they have to, they have to believe something with evidence. They have to have evidence to believe anything, but then they'll believe things like what's in the Da Vinci Code book, or believe all these conspiracy theories about the birth of Jesus and Jesus mythicism and the birth of Christianity. All this stuff has no evidence to back it up, like none, and they just believe it without question. And so I noticed a lot of things like that kind of turned me off towards atheism. So
Yeah, I noticed that too, because I feel like I understand the atheists or the agnostics who don't look into Christianity and have not investigated and have not, gone online and tried to fight against Christians and do things like that. Sometimes I think it might be due just to apathy, that could be something where you're just sort of wandering around apathetic. But I am always curious about the ones who spend all the time to write refutations or to look into the Bible and to look into the evidence that we have, because I feel like if you get that evidence, and how do you not see it? It just, I mean, I remember when I first got online and I started finding, currently making a sweet response video. Oh, good. So Rob is making a response video, Sentinel Apologetics on Book of Daniel. Yes, that's awesome. I love the Book of Daniel. So
I'm
so
glad
what
he's
I,
not. I'm
well,
glad
what
he's
I,
not making a response video to me. Like Philip Cottraux in his interview with S.J. Thomas and doesn't know what he's talking about.
well, that's the thing. Once you put out the information, you put out all the evidence, and then here's what happened. So I get on Twitter, and I hadn't really interacted with too many atheists. And then I found William Lane Craig and I started reading his stuff. And I found one of his articles was so powerful that I got on Twitter. I said, atheists, if you read this, you will definitely convert to Christianity. You won't have a choice. And then, they read it and then they'd get back to me and they're like, yeah, I don't see what you're talking about.
Yeah. We were all young and naive at one point like that too. I was too. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. So yeah, I'm really excited about Sentinel. So here's the deal with the Book of Daniel. Have you ever looked into the dating of the Book of Daniel?
Oh yeah, extensively.
So what's your take on it? Do you think it's 6
I
BC?
I agree with you because I'm reading your book too, by the way, and I'm actually about halfway through it, just like you're halfway through mine. And so I've gotten through all the dating the Book of Daniel, and Mike Winger has a really good video
He
on it as
does.
well. So yeah, I mean, part of my problem is the late dating of Daniel. The whole story behind that theory is kind of shady because it started with an anti-Bible, skeptical criticism movement that started in Germany, like in the 1800s, and that's when ideas like that, like the documentary hypothesis of the Torah, or even Jesus mythicism, all kind of started from Germany in the 1800s, and there is kind of a shady history behind that, and yeah, I think the problem is, like, you can say that Daniel is so exact in its predictions, and I can see why people would just have a hard time believing that it got so much right. So they'll date it because the Dead Sea Scrolls. When was the earliest Dead Sea Scroll that Daniel found? It was like 165 BC. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Book of Daniel predicts things that will happen after that, and it got those right because it doesn't just predict Jesus; it also predicts the destruction of the temple, and it predicts the Emperor Titus destroying the temple and everything, which we know happened about 100 years afterwards. So to me, it's like I just kind of stand back and trust that the book, has prophetic, has a lot of profound prophecy, divine prophecy in it. So I'm not going to put it in the Maccabean period just because it's so hard to believe that, that it got so much right.
Yeah. Well, actually, just like what you're saying, even in the thing is, if people, Daniel number one was demoted. I mean, Josephus referred to Daniel as a prophet. Jesus referred to Daniel as a prophet, and suddenly later, the Jewish people decided that he was not a prophet. And I think that's because the book includes so many incredible predictions that came
Right.
true. A lot of them have already come true. I think that's part of it. As far as, I mean, I think the reason why some people don't, why the Jewish people, for example, is a lot of the predictions had to do with Jesus. And so,
Right.
so that was something that they're going against. But the other thing about the book of Daniel that I find fascinating is uh, Porphyry was the first, it was around 250 or so AD. He comes out with this book called Against Christians. And he basically said that he looked at Daniel and he said, oh, he must have been describing and was it Epiphanes or Antiphanes, something like that. Antiochus, that's it.
Yeah.
Antiochus from 165 BC. But actually, I'm not even sure Daniel's describing that character at all. And so then he decided to sort of redate the whole thing. And then people ignored it for all these centuries. And like you mentioned, then all of a sudden the Germans in the 1800s come out with all these different theories of mythicism and late dating for Daniel and all that.
And it's funny because a lot of those ideas have been disproven at this point, but there's still so many people that believe it. But Jesus mythicism is the big one. I'll give the late dating of Daniel more credibility than I will Jesus mythicism. I don't think there's even a trace of evidence. If you read like Richard Carrier and guys like that, and the ideas, the theories they came up with to get around there being a historical Jesus, it's just so out there, it just doesn't make any sense. So
Yeah. No, I agree. And Sentinel is saying that the Dead Sea Scroll dating is 0.1% of the tip of the iceberg that a Maccabean dating cannot work. And the other thing about Maccabean is this idea of, Greek was prevalent in the time that they're claiming that Daniel was written, 165 BC, 165 BC. Greek was prevalent. So why would there only be 3 Greek words in the whole book that were musical instruments?
right. Yeah, and actually, reading through your book, I've came across something I didn't know, was that that Josephus actually records that when Alexander the Great arrived in Jerusalem, that he was shown the book of Daniel. What is that, like in the 300s BC or some time around
Exactly,
then?
332
I
BC.
didn't know that, so I actually learned something there.
Yeah, I know. Once in a while, we might each have a little nugget that we can show each other.
Yep.
So no, it's good. So Phil, how can people find you on? I know you're on social media. You want to share some information about how they can find you, either there plus your book. I think I've got your book linked here, but if I haven't, I will do that.
I'm on Twitter. You can follow me. It's at Depths Pentecost, DEPTHS Pentecost. My website is depthsofpentecost.com. Um, as far as Amazon, I mean, you can follow the link Stephanie provides, or you can just go to Amazon and just look up Bringing the Exodus to Life, and it should be the only one that comes up. I can also send an autographed copy if anybody wants one, and it's $16.95 on Amazon, but I'll only charge you $15 for it, and I'll pay the shipping, so you'll save a little bit to order it that way, and I can sign it for you as well. The reason why is I've got a box of them sitting in my kitchen pantry that I'm just trying to get rid of, so you can save a little bit, and I can sell a few more that way. You'll just have to direct message me on Twitter somehow your address and send me the money on PayPal, but we can arrange that. So
Yeah, that sounds good. I was just looking at here. It's Richard Carrier. I don't know. Does Richard Carrier really believe that? Richard Carrier believes a lot of weird things, like Jesus is a myth, but he also appears women who are well endowed is an airtight argument against God. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, haven't heard that one before, but okay.
Was it Chesterton who said this? And I think, when you don't believe in God, then you start believing in a lot of different things.
Well, I had an atheist one time on Twitter. I complained about my allergies. Like I said, oh man, allergy season here is it. And he zeroed in on that and replied, well, that proves that your God doesn't exist because allergies. Why would a perfect, loving God design us to be vulnerable to allergic reactions? I'm like, I don't even know what to say to that. So
no, I know.
I didn't dignify him with a response over that one.
Yeah, no, that's funny. So, okay. So Mr. Phil Fox, he actually put a link to your book, which is good. So
thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so people can, he's got it right here it's right here in the chat. So if you guys want to link up to it, make sure you buy his book, or he can mail it to you if you want. You can find, and did you mention a website? Do you have a website called Depths of Pentecost too?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So actually, I'm not very familiar with the Pentecostal church. I want to ask you another question on that really quickly before we part. But is that a church where you speak in tongues?
Yes, but Pentecostal really isn't a church or a denomination, although there's some churches that will call themselves that. It's more of an adjective. There's a lot of Pentecostal denominations. The largest one is the Assemblies of God, which John Hagee is, he's a member of that. There's also the Church of God. There's the Pentecostal Holiness Churches. Now, some of them are more radical than others. Like we also have a church called the United Pentecostal Church, and they go a little too far out there for my taste because they don't let their women, they take the Bible so literally that they don't let their women get haircuts and things like that, or wear makeup.
Oh, really? Oh, I would like that.
Yeah, that's going a little bit too far for me, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, more questions about that?
No, I just don't know anything about it. See, I was raised in a Catholic church, so I was very familiar with the Catholic church. I got married in a Lutheran church, and I was very familiar with the Lutheran church. That's what my mother-in-law and my husband, they liked the Lutheran faith. And then my family and my husband and I, we gradually moved into this Baptist church. So now I'm familiar with 3 different denominations, but you can see there's many more that I'm not familiar with.
Well, Pentecostals, we're strictly Arminian, so we believe entirely in free will. I know
I do too.
And that's good. The Baptist church is kind of give or take on Arminianism versus Calvinism, because you have the free will Baptists who totally believe in Arminianism as we do, but then you've got some that are just completely 100% Calvinist on that. And I pretty much totally reject Calvinism. So
I'm not a Calvinist.
But as far as like the basic salvation message, I think we all believe the same thing. The resurrection of Christ. Jesus came, he died on the cross, he rose again for our sins. That's the most important thing.
I agree. Jesse Camping wants to know if we talked about Hyksos, Hyksos.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there, in the late Middle Kingdom of Egypt, and I do cover this in the book, there was a group of people. We call them the Hyksos, but they didn't really call themselves that. It's a modern name that we came up with to ascribe to them. And what they did was they conquered Egypt. Now, how they conquered Egypt, because they were foreigners, how they did it is not entirely clear, whether it was through the archaeologists have mostly said it was through force that they conquered, although some think that they were migrants. And some people believe that the Hyksos were actually the Israelites themselves. I don't share that view, but they were driven out of Egypt, and that actually led to the beginning of the New Kingdom era. So there was a pharaoh, and I forgot his name again. So I read the book in preparation for this again this week, but I'm still forgetting some of the names. But the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom actually drove out the Hyksos with military force, and they had to flee into the desert. So how they play into the Exodus story is a little bit controversial. It's a little bit back and forth on that, but it is an interesting subject.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. So the Hyksos, yeah, we'll have to look into that. I'm looking forward to finishing. I started your book and then I got so busy with work and everything else, trying to get up to my spring break. This is my spring break next week. So now I have
Oh,
more time.
yeah, spring break. You work in a university. That spring break. That's something I forgot about. That's so long ago for me. Like remembering what spring break is. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, my kids have spring break too. So they don't, our weeks are following each other. So but
yeah,
anyway, so it's pretty exciting. I'm excited about spring break. I'm excited about summer too. I like all the breaks. The breaks are good. So
yeah, those were the days.
yeah.
I have to keep working no matter what. So
Yep. Well, I think we all have to work. So, all right. Well, listen, Phil, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. I love this. Everybody, again, go out and pick up a copy of Phil's book. You can reach him on Twitter. You can reach him. I'm put links in here. You've got a couple of links that Mr. Phil Fox has posted.
mhm.
So I think this is good stuff.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. It has been a thrill and a privilege beyond all comprehension to be here. So.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming in here. Just going to go ahead and end the stream.